Hello and welcome everybody. I am Sightless Kombat, accessibility consultant and gamer without sight. Welcome to Accessibility in Games Challenges and Progression. So this is going to be a quick, discussion / demonstration of sorts of the accessibility of games and some of the challenges I face as a gamer without sight. So what is a gamer without sight? Sorry, I've realized I've not put my accessibility badge on. So while I'm continuing, so as a gamer without sight, I have no sight whatsoever. I use the term because legal blindness, often just shortened to being blind, can and often does include usable and or residual vision, which I've never had. Then again, I still get people asking me, "Oh, how much can you see then?" So irrespective of how much I try and be clear, sometimes it isn't always that. But what I do as an accessibility consultant, I go around and do studio visits, or I did before lockdown kicked in. I do remote studio work as well. I speak at events like this and the Game Accessibility Conference, as well as others. And I write reviews for my website, do streams on Twitch, put videos up on YouTube, and have discussions on Twitter, all of which you will find links to at the end of this. So first, a few housekeeping things, which Daffod, if you wouldn't mind going through these, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, of course. So feel free to have kind of video and stuff like that, so you can see me, but please kind of stay muted if possible. Hopefully we're over the technical stuff, but if there are technical problems or any questions, feel free to use the chat. There should be automatic captions provided. If you want to go to the toolbar, there should be a kind of 3 dots options, which I will see if I can enable on my side now. So I'm going to my 3 dots, I'm turning on captions to drop down, which I am not getting an option for on my side. I don't know if that's because I'm not being put down as the organizer.
Oh, I don't know.
No, I'm going to have to throw out 2. I think we've got
Amanda, possibly.
Amanda, I think Rinda. So I've not got any captions in my options.
I do have captions showing on my screen.
So they should theoretically be available to everybody else.
Yes.
Okay, so is that all you? Oh no, there's one final thing I think on this.
BSL interpretation. Then it's messaging the @help desk. And also should be a kind of code of conduct that should be available in the files tab if you want to get some more information about the event. And that's everything on this housekeeping slide.
Okay, so let's jump directly in. I won't be going into everything in terms of how video games work, but the first thing we're going to cover is menus and UI. So user interface, for those unfamiliar with the term UI, you will hear that a fair amount from me throughout this presentation. And let's start with what happens if you don't have any sighted assistance to get things working. So what we used to have to do, it's thankfully a rarer occurrence now, but we used to have to use optical character recognition, or OCR. This is just a heading, but what I'm going to show you. So basically, OCR is normally done through software. It can be done through apps as well on things like smartphones or on PC through screen readers now. JAWS supports it, NVDA supports it. But essentially, you extrapolate the text from an image, and that text is then able to be read by the screen reader. Now, this can work with video games, but it can be very, very hit or miss, let's just say. And these next few slides are going to illustrate that quite well, I think. I'll do my best to describe these. I was originally going to call this OCR, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but didn't want to get a copyright strike on anything. So here is OCR, the very, very annoying, the okay, and the really useful. So the first image we have here is from Halo 5 Guardians. So with all of these, on the left-hand side is the game image, and on the right-hand side should be, if everything's working well, the text that is rendered out to the screen reader. This first image is from Halo 5 Guardians, and essentially, for those who can see, you can see on the right-hand side that there's not very much there. So essentially, or not very much of comprehensibility there, because on the left-hand side, there's a grid of options, essentially, and the grid doesn't render very well for screen readers. And also, as a general thing, the interface for Halo 5 in this menu as well wraps left to right and bottom to top. So it is very, very, very easy to get completely turned around and confused. So that's a very big problem. And part of it as well isn't helped by the animations and things and the fonts and the backgrounds that accompany this screen. So let's move on to the next one. So this is Killer Instinct, a game that I'm relatively well known for playing massive amounts of over the past several years and fighting people, including Ken Lobb, who was one of the original creators of the Killer Instinct or KI franchise. This is actually a story screen from the game's Season 1 story mode. And essentially, as you can see, for those who can see on the right-hand side, the text pretty much matches. It's a little inconsistent, but it's not too bad. There are a couple of idiosyncrasies here and there, but it's definitely better than what we saw with Halo 5. One of the key things to note here is that you can actually see the difficulty level as hard there. If I were to want to change that to, say, beat the game on the hardest difficulty level, which isn't actually hard, ironically, it is actually called Ultimate Kyle for reasons best left to the developers to explain. You can actually change it, re-OCR the screen, and refresh the text. And all being well, you would actually see the image change. So let's move on to the next one, which is the best one of these really to show it off. This is actually from Halo the Master Chief Collection, which has had numerous accessibility improvements in terms of in terms of over the last year or so. But this screenshot is from Halo 3's campaign screen. And if you look carefully at the words, for those of you who can see on the right-hand side, all the information is there. So I know what option I'm on because it says resume Halo 3 campaign. And, that's a little tooltip of sorts. And all the other information there, so, your playlist options and all of that is rendered relatively well in terms of ease of use. But if you were going to actually use this, if you went into the Master Chief Collection now, you would realize that this OCR isn't actually necessary to use these menus because in the patch they introduced Halo Reach into the Master Chief Collection. The developers also added menu and UI narration for screens like this. So it thereby makes it a sort of moot point in the best way possible. But OCR is still needed in certain cases for things like the new PlayStation 5 games at times, or games that you can run on consoles that are compatible with the Xbox Console Companion app. Unfortunately, the newer Xbox app that was recently released doesn't support OCR because it doesn't have the same streaming functions, at least not that I've been able to find as of the time of actually delivering this presentation. Final screen for this section, for this OCR section at least, is from Final Fantasy VII, and this is an example of how adversely impactful the use of images can be when you render your icons as buttons. So, for instance, you have an icon that says, square or circle, because this is a PS4 game, and unfortunately, the only thing you get rendered is circle is rendered as O on the right-hand side. So you have no real understanding of what buttons to press to achieve the functions like attacking, evading, guarding, etc. that are listed in the right and the left-hand side of the screen, along with the rest of it. So, David, you got any points from that thus far?
One kind of question that kind of popped into the chat because someone mentioned that some of the speech view that's kind of coming through, seems to be some that are kind of in all caps and some that are in low caps. I was wondering if that was just a quirk of the way in which you have the log for the speech, or if that was something that
I think
had an impact on the audio.
I just copied the text from the speech viewer. That's literally all I did to get it to render like that. That's not a thing. I've not modified that myself, if that's what you're wondering, just to be clear. But if that clarifies that, then we'll move on to the next section, which is essentially menu narration. So So, oh, when you said the speech view is coming through, is the NVDA itself coming through, or is that just on the
No.
screen? Okay.
So as an example, with when you were showing off Halo, I think it kind of seemed like
Oh,
some of the
different.
speech was formatted slightly differently to some other speech.
Oh, okay.
I'm guessing that was maybe just the kind of copying and pasting process
Yeah.
rather than something.
Yeah. Sounds about right. No, that's cool. Just wanted to clear that up before I move on. So, the great thing about a lot of, well, the two newest sets of consoles that have come out from both Sony and Microsoft, the PS5 and the Xbox Series X specifically, and the Series S as well, are that they actually both have menu narration and pretty extensive as well. You can actually set both of the consoles up with no sighted assistance whatsoever. So for the PlayStation 5, you leave it for 60 seconds and the screen reader will activate automatically to guide you through the setup process. And with the Xbox side of things, you essentially, once you've left the console for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, after it's booted in, you can press and hold the Xbox button and then press the menu button to activate narrator, which again will then guide you through the process. But what I thought I'd show is just how extensive these UI systems actually are. So let's show, oh, actually, I will preface this by saying the speeds of these are adjustable, but these are the speeds that I utilize in my day-to-day usage of the consoles. So let's start with the Xbox side.
Sightless Kombat window, right tab, 5 of 6. Add or switch, sign out, settings, button, 4 of 7. Settings window, general, 1 of 6. Select, account, 2 of 6. Selected. System, 3 of 6.
So
Selected.
moving into
Devices and connections, 4 of 6. Select.
the
Preferences, 5 of 6.
settings menu
Select.
here.
Ease of access, 6 of 6. Selected. Narrator, 1 of 6. Magnifier, 2 of 6. Closed captioning, 3 of 6. Audio, 6 of 6. Controller, 5 of 6. High contrast, 4 of 6. Controller, 5 of 6. Button mapping, button, 1 of 3. Vibration settings, button, 2 of. Copilot settings, button, 3 of 3. Ease of access, 6 of 6. Home window, resume, launch, settings. Press the menu button for more options. Button, press the Y button to search. Press the view button to customize. 1 of 1.
So you can hear it gives you a lot of information there and lots of useful prompts. That final one of those final options you heard on that controller on the controller screen was Copilot, even though it mispronounced it. And you'll hear a little more about Copilot later. Now let's move on to show the PlayStation 5.
Your games home. Button. Press cross to select. 1 of 5. Your media home. Search. Settings. Settings. Network. Accessibility. Button. Press cross to select. Users guide. Health and safety and other information. Accessibility. Network. Users and accounts. Family and parental controls. System. Storage. Sound. Screen and video. Accessories. Save data and game slash. Notification. Save data and game slash app settings. Button. Notifications. Button. Captures and broadcasts. Button. Press cross to select.
And that little cue means I've hit the end of the menu.
Notifications. Button. Press cross to settings. Button.
And then
Press cross
we've
to
just
select.
backed out of
4
there.
of 5.
So that's a fine example of how Sony's narration has come along in the past 5 years, because with the PlayStation 4, the narration, the text-to-speech feature, which is essentially what this is, but on those older systems, was region locked via hardware to the US, which was a real shame. But now they've rolled that out. In their words, they've rolled it out globally, though I'm not sure if all languages are supported. And narrator is also fairly widely supported as well. All you have to do is just be willing to use your screen reader in a different language, potentially, if your region isn't directly supported. So we'll show the next couple of slides and then we'll move into the next heading. So we'll show these next couple and then we'll see if there's any questions that come up. So you've seen how consoles handle narration in the direct sense for their menus and UI. But what about when games do it? So there's been a few games from Microsoft over the past couple of years that have actually used the platform level features from the developer standpoint to hook into the system and actually use the text-to-speech features that you've already seen in Narrator, or that sort of underpin it to actually create their menus. So let's show an example of that with Gears 5.
Options. Controller, game, video, audio, matchmaking, mature content.
So this is
accessibility,
in-game
item
menus, just
7
to be
of
clear.
9, colorblind mode, campaign camera shape.
And
PV,
sometimes it cuts
campaign
itself off for
camera
no
shape,
discernible
on.
reason.
PV camera shape. Target lock on beginner difficulty, on. Item fabricator ping, on. Item 5 subtitles, on. Subtitles, button tap challenges, press and hold.
Yeah, like
Vibration,
that.
on. Item text to speech on. Speech to text. Easy navigation off. Swaps fixed while aimed. Off. Single stick movement. Font size. Toggle aim off. Item 16 of 60.
So you can see there's a massive amount of accessibility options there. And let's show the PlayStation side of things with a demo of The Last of Us 2. And I had to cut a few of these elements in terms of the text-to-speech just for the sake of time. So if it sounds a little fading, if it sounds like it's fading in and out a lot, then that's why. So let's show an example of how their menu narration works, where they essentially packed all of the samples into the game itself.
Press any button. Story. Options. Accessibility. Language accessibility. Alternate controls. Navigation and traversal. Navigation assistance. On. Pressing L3 button faces the camera in the direction of story progression, marking the path to follow. If enhanced listen mode is also enabled, then pressing L3 button while in listen mode, hold A1 button will instead direct the player towards the most recently scanned item or enemy. Navigation and text-to-speech and audio cues. Traversal audio cues, on, enables additional accessibility audio cues to assist with traversal and exploration. Plays a sound cue for jumpable gaps, climbable ledges, and squeeze-throughs. Areas that require
So you can hear
crouching
it's
or going
listing
prone.
all of this information on
Interacts
its
and
own.
pickups. Nearby breakable glass. Gaining or losing movement control. When ledge guard is enabled, plays a sound cue when it activates. Combat audio cues, on, enables additional accessibility audio cues to assist with combat and stealth. Plays a sound cue for additional sound cue information, consult the audio cue glossary.
Oh, and you may have heard the combat audio cues mentioned there. You'll see an example of those later. And you'll also see an example of, in the Gears 5 menu demo, there was a mention of target lock. So you'll see an example of that later. So do we have any questions from the chat, David? Do we have any?
So I've got some questions. I've got some questions from me, but I'll
I've
be
heard
nice.
you've been frantically typing over there.
Well,
Just
I'll be nice. I think Andrew Coleman, and this isn't so much kind of specifically with the UI stuff, but he noted that Google Stadia has been speaking about some text-to-speech stuff coming soon, and wanted to know if you've been aware of that at all or had any experience with the Google Stadia stuff.
I actually tried Stadia the other day, and it was actually not great because when I wanted to try and OCR the window to see what screen of the game I was on that I was playing, that being Immortals Phoenix Rising by Ubisoft, the demo for that, I actually I actually had an issue with that because I couldn't OCR the fact that it was in its own separate sort of sandbox in Chrome. I don't think necessarily helped, but I wasn't aware that they were adding TTS. That's going to be very interesting indeed to see where that goes. I'm surprised I haven't heard more about it, to be honest.
So apparently there's a mention of it in the settings, but might not be available yet. So maybe that's one to look out for.
Yep, I agree. I'll keep my eyes and ears peeled. Pun definitely intended with the former.
Some questions from me. I'm going to be cheeky and throw some of my own questions in.
Okay.
You showed off getting access to a screen reader on like system boot. So like if you for example leave it alone for a while. But I think it's similar to Windows especially. Like Cortana will eventually say, "Oh, do you want to have a screen reader for the installation process?" I was wondering if. So similar to like iPhones, where there's a shortcut for turning a screen reader on and off. Ditto on like Android phones, TalkBack. Are there any video game console shortcuts to toggling like narrator on and off?
Yeah, well, you said narrator, and that's the exact one I was going to refer to, because narrator actually has its own shortcut. You press and hold the Xbox button, it vibrates, and then you press the menu button, and it will turn narrator on and off, depending on whether it's on or not in the first place. The PlayStation 5 screen reader currently doesn't have a shortcut, unfortunately, but it has been suggested by numerous people, myself included, in various discussions with what you might loosely term as the correct people. So, so who knows? That might happen in the future. So if that's everything, we should move on to the next.
I have one more question.
Okay. No, I'm just conscious of time. That's all.
Okay, I'll listen. One thing that we've seen with kind of TV screen readers is that there can be an okay system level screen reader, but then you kind of get into like an app on the TV itself, and it gets a bit sluggish, gets a bit weird, and some TV apps then want to make their own screen reader.
Really?
And
Oh, good lord.
Yeah, because
Oh,
because
actually, yes,
TV
no, the YouTube app on PlayStation 5 does just that. So I'm just thinking that does happen. So narrator usually works with apps. I've had a couple of odd instances where it doesn't, which is a real shame. But the PlayStation 5 one, given it's newer,
Kate, you've
doesn't.
got some homework to do today. Can you get going on it?
Oh, I think Kirsty.
See you, love. Did you have a good day today?
I think
Kirsty,
somebody
could you mute
is.
yourself, please?
Kirsty, do you mind?
Oh, did you see your new pencil case?
I will. Oh, I thought it manually.
Thank
There we
you.
go.
That was
Apologies,
interesting.
everyone.
Sorry, everybody. Yeah, so the PlayStation 5 one, given it's newer, is slightly odd in terms of that. I tried Disney Plus, Twitch, and YouTube. YouTube was the only one that had any kind of functionality, but it seemed to be very hit or miss, which is a bit of a shame. So we'll see what happens over the coming months, I think, with that. So yeah, it's a very interesting time for seeing stuff like that develop. So let's go on to the next thing, shall we? Which is navigation and traversal. So navigation and traversal is a very interesting thing because a lot of people are like, how do we make things work like this? You know, when you've got no sight. And that kind of comes into Copilot and things like that. So Copilot, I mentioned it very briefly earlier, is an Xbox system level feature on all Xbox One consoles and the newer Series S and X consoles as well, that allows two controllers to essentially simultaneously act as one. I believe you can have more connected, but I've never really tried any of that. I've only ever used two in my testing and my work with it. But essentially, it means that you can have a sighted player with you, and you can actually have them running around and jumping and navigating, etc., or aiming, and you can be doing the shooting, combat, and whatever else. Fortunately, there are games that actually allow me to have some agency in that, in terms of the traversal side, one of which is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. And what I'm going to show is a demo of the wall running in that game. Now, of course, there is no way for me to send the haptics from the game over to you watching this, unfortunately. But suffice it to say, as you reach the end of the wall run itself, there is a cue for when to hit the jump button to then chain into the next wall run. So this is actually a sequence where we'll do 3 successive wall runs as part of a chain, and then jump off and then turn back around and repeat it. So I'm just going to let this play and you will hopefully see what I mean. Well, I mean, pun intended. So we're lining up, we jump onto the wall, we jump, and then we land. So we're going to go turn back around. 1, 2, 3. And we land. So you can hear the transition there, but that is all facilitated via the haptics. But I have a co-pilot there to guide me into the wall run in the first place.
Good.
You okay? You okay?
I think that was Larry. Who I'll see if I can mute as well.
Okay.
Thank
No.
you, Larry.
Just checking everyone's okay over there. So you can see how that works in terms of the haptics actually allow me to have some kind of agency. But now to a game that has complete agency. So the next clip you're going to see is all entirely me doing this on my own. This is from The Last of Us 2. And the way this works is via waypoint finding. So essentially, if I press L3, it will then orient the camera and show a little marker as to where to go. So it will orient the camera towards where I need to go to progress. And there are cues for when I'm going to fall off a ledge, when I'm going to need to jump, when I'm going to when I reach a waypoint as well. So the sort of, I don't know how best to describe it, sort of a sonar style cue indicates that I'm searching for the waypoint, and then there's a higher version of that that indicates when I've reached the waypoint and need to rescan. And there's also cues for crouching and standing up, but I won't go through all of those, but I'll just let those play for you. And hopefully if you can see, you'll be able to figure it out. If you can't see, it should be relatively clear anyway, but if you need any clarification on that, I can do that at the end possibly. So this is all me, bear in mind. So that's the cue for falling off a ledge and looking at a waypoint. And that means I can jump over there. I'm going to slowly progress over here. Make sure I'm facing the right way, because this is quite a precarious segment. There's the jump cue again. I was about to fall off the ledge, and now I need to crouch. So we're going to slowly maneuver our way across. and left, so we don't fall off the ledge, the edge of the traversal section we're on. We keep reaching waypoints and rescanning, and we need to line ourselves up for this jump, and now we stand up. Now this is the jump. There we go. That rather loud sort of crunch noise indicated that we got to the end of that section. I have died numerous times on that section because I've mistimed my jumps and sort of fallen to my death, which is not good. And now we'll show the final clip of this section, and that is the question of how do you do this when you don't have waypoints or a direct waypoint, or you're just navigating towards a single solitary object. Enter Gears 5 and Gears of War 4's feature Fabricator Ping, which I don't have time to tell you the full story of now during this presentation or panel or whatever you want to call this. But I would be happy to tell you afterwards, partly because I had a hand in it. So what I'm going to show you is me navigating to an object called the Fabricator, which is how you start a Horde match, which is a PvE, so player versus environment mode, where you're fighting off large numbers of enemies as a team. So that pinging noise, I'm pressing and holding down the TACCOM button, which essentially shows you various items on the battlefield. And that pinging noise is where the Fabricator is. So I'm running towards it, and as you can hear, the ping is increasing in frequency and in pitch, much like a sonar system on a submarine. So I've mistimed my run there slightly, and I'm lining up the Fabricator and going to pick it up.
Moving the Fabricator.
And that's
Wave
Marcus
one,
Phoenix.
Prepare your defense.
Time to build.
And you heard it say wave 1, prepare your defenses as well. So that was quite good, that it narrates what wave you're on and things like that. So any questions on navigation and traversal from you, David, or anyone else in the chat?
So I can't see anything in the chat, but I think one thing that stood out for me was when you were showing off The Last of Us, so that the kind of one where it was the kind of jumping, jumping on like the girders and stuff like that, and you kind of mentioned, oh, this was somewhere that I died quite a lot. It kind of seemed to me that kind of one solution to that kind of accessibility challenge would have been to put up, you know, kind of huge virtual railings so that it was impossible for you to fall off and call that accessibility. But in as much as, well, all players fall off and make mistakes, so a really important part for that with me was, you know, you got through it and you died along the way, but that was part of the game rather than
exactly. Yeah, it's very much that section can be very, very tricky. Even if you know it's going to happen, it can still be quite tricky because you have to sort of negotiate your way through these small sections where if you slightly misalign your jump, then you sort of fling yourself off the edge, and it's like and you're like, oh, whoops. Right, let's go again.
So Richard asks, I think, something kind of similar. So he kind of says, do you think game designers get the kind of balance, between kind of difficulty and assistance correct? Is it kind of fun while still challenging and rewarding? It must be quite a kind of careful balance. That I can imagine it must be this kind of quite careful balance between assistance and challenge.
I mean, I think with Last of Us 2, they did a really good job of it. Because it's the first game where a lot of these features existed outside of this in other games, and you'll see what I mean in a minute with combat as well. But essentially, you know, this is the first. Last of Us 2 is the first game to put all of these features into one cohesive package, and for a first effort, it's really, really good. There's a couple of points where I know sighted players can run through, but I don't know whether I can run through myself. They can escape completely unharmed, whereas I would possibly get spotted by enemies, but you know, that's part of the learning process, I feel. And speaking of enemies, unless you have anything else to add.
I was about to say, I think I don't know if you've seen any of the kind of stuff that Tomb Raider did, but it just kind of one of the solutions to that. This challenge was just loads of different sliders.
Oh yes, so, difficulty levels and things. Yeah, so you can set your. Actually, Last of Us 2 has that. Saying that, you've got difficulties for, I think it's perception, for sort of enemy accuracy. There's all kinds of interesting things. Resources, allies, the player. So you can be super powerful, do lots of damage, but have really, really hard enemies that will just come and murder you. It gets very interesting.
So I think part of the answer to the kind of question then is this kind of like, well, part of this kind of conversation is game designer putting stuff in to allow people to kind of set their own balance between what assistance they want, what challenge they want.
Like I could play through on very hard or survivor, like the high difficulties, but still set my resources so that I've got enough to get through without having to really be stressed out about the scavenging, etc. I mean, I could even put infinite resources on if I wanted to, which is a thing that I've done for playthroughs. But should we move on to the final section? Because I think parts of that will also elaborate on what we've already discussed.
We've got another question, but if we've got plenty of time later on, we can come back to it.
I mean, we can quickly go through it now.
So Piers asked, how does Gears of War distance navigation do interaction with obstacles like those cover blocks?
It doesn't. There's your answer. It doesn't, because you literally just hit geometry and you have to figure out your own way round. But I have been trying to sort of like let the coalition know that there needs to be improvements to that in terms of the ability to navigate, because Horde is the only real thing that's playable solo at the moment, and it's only really on one map it's fully viable, which is a shame. But hopefully they'll improve that, and they have been adding accessibility things. They've been tweaking stuff as they've gone through title updates. So speaking of Gears and what Gears does well, let's go on to the final. Oh, I broke it. The final section, which is combat. And what we're going to show first is how Gears 5 does combat in the form of target lock. Essentially, just to explain the way it works is you line up a shot horizontally. It is only available on beginner difficulty, which is really surprising to me and really frustrating. But I can sort of understand why, because there are modes that encompasses that have leaderboards, but that's a whole other discussion. But essentially, target lock, you line up a shot horizontally, you mark and you aim at an enemy and you mark it, and the game pretty much does the rest, but it's not always flawless. But in this demonstration, I think I hit pretty much every shot I take, so make of that what you will. This is me playing as a sniper, which is an absolutely fantastic thing to be able to do. So I'm just going to play this.
Watch it! Blue!
So I'm using the audio cues here to line these up. And wait for the next shot.
Judy!
And the drone behind it. There we go. So there's lots of sound cues going on there that indicate what's going on. So you've got the footsteps, you've got the drones sort of, and the juvies making their different sound cues. You've got the drones firing their guns, which are really useful to line up with. Because normally if they're shooting you, you can make the shot as well. You can make the retaliatory shot to take them out. And it's not flawless, granted, but that demo, hitting those sort of 6 or so kills in a row, was absolutely just a great moment for me. I was just like, oh my word, I managed to kill all of these in a row. So that was great. And I've since gone on to improve my my sniping skills as well. And I'm still playing Gears with those things in mind, but I just wish that feature could be, improved so that you could easily, work out where you were in terms of geometry and all of that as well, and maybe even use it in an actual multiplayer environment against other players. But that's, again, a whole other discussion. Now, how do games handle both ranged and melee combat when it's not necessarily a shooter? So what we're going to look at is Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order using the Battle Grid, which is a sort of training simulator that you can customize yourself. So you can take on whatever you want as you set it up. So I'm going to let this play and talk. Actually, can you hear me when I'm talking over these clips? You should be able to, hopefully.
They are quite loud.
Okay. In which case, I would just talk. I would just explain this first then. So essentially, what I'm going to do first is show off fighting ranged troopers. You'll hear a sort of a cue for when the trooper is preparing to fire, and you'll hear a cue for when they actually release they fire their blasters, and that's what I'm using to time my parries. And I'm setting that all up because the grid system that the battle grid actually uses for placement of enemies doesn't wrap around, and is relatively easy to follow once you've done it a few times, again, with sighted assistance. So the Gears demo, for anyone who's wondering, was me on my own, and this Fallen Order demo is also me on my own in terms of arranging the grid and doing all the combat. Then we move on to a melee setup where we see a bunch of melee only troopers running in, and you'll hear their footsteps and their wind up cues for their attacks, which is what I use to parry when I manage it, and how I know I've been hit when I don't. So let's just roll this clip, and I will talk over it afterwards if I need to clarify anything that I feel I've missed. So that's the UI for the battle grid. That's me placing enemies with a little sighted assistance to figure out what enemies I wanted to place. That's counting me in. And here we go.
An intruder! That's probably not good.
You can hear that cue for...
Quick! Dodge this! Going to beat you, Jedi!
And then that cue means training's complete. So it's all very relatively clear cut, I would argue, in terms of what the audio means. So now for the melee set.
The Jedi should run from this squadron.
So they're running in.
Step back, I've got this.
Waiting.
Don't let him break your guard. All that's left.
Ooh, finish him off in style, that final one. So as you can see there, Fallen Order's combat is very, very smooth and very, very fluid. But the audio cues there are what make, I would argue, 90% of the combat doable. There are enemies that that have a lot less in terms of audio cues to work with, but the standard enemies are usually pretty good, and their battle chatter, as it were, is pretty solid as well in terms of telling you what's going on. So let's move on back to the sort of shooter spectrum, but with Last of Us 2, I said I was going to show combat, and I will. This is showing the aiming and hit markers, as well as how the lock-on works as well. And again, this is all me doing all of this for this demo. And yes, I'm using infinite arrows, but that's just to show the sort of slightly stealthy side of everything. So there's 3 cues here. There's the higher one is the head, the middle cue is the center of mass, and the lower one is for the legs. And you hear I just got a kill there. That's what that little sort of drum cue is. That cue's for going prone. That enemy was spotting me, which is why that additional cue played. That was a hit marker to indicate I'd stunned the enemy. Missed that shot. There was no hit marker there. That was a kill through body armor. And that kill there. I hit that shot, but it didn't kill him. And there's the kill shot. I apologize if parts of that commentary might have been lost, sort of covered up by the audio, but hopefully it was easy enough to understand in general. Now let's come on to the final clip of the entire, this entire set, showing off how Parsec works. So Parsec is essentially Copilot over the internet. So let's just go back a little. So Copilot is the Xbox One feature where you can control a game with 2 controllers acting as one. On the PlayStation 5, if you want to use it, you can use a similar thing, but in a hardware format via a thing called a Titan 2, which is a small box that you plug 2 controllers into that then can act as one. Unfortunately, the new DualSense controller doesn't yet work with the Titan 2, but I hope that can change soon so I can actually play my PS5 games with sighted assistance. It would be amazing if PlayStation 5 consoles actually added that feature as a native thing, so we wouldn't have to buy extra equipment though in the future. Now Parsec is essentially allowing for the controller not to have to be in the same physical location along with the player, like Copilot or the Titan 2 do, where you're both in the same room, but it allows for a person to connect over the internet if you set it up right. It's a PC program and application where you can remotely control PCs, but also set it up to support game controllers. And if you run it into the back of the Titan 2, the adapter I mentioned just now, you can actually have it so that a player can control even across continents and countries. So Jenna, who you will hear in this next demo, is actually in the States while I'm in the UK, if that gives you any idea of the distances we're working with. And Jenna has near zero latency, maybe a slight amount of lag, but not much really in the way of noticeable lag, which is absolutely phenomenal. So she can see my game. And in this demo, she is helping me move into combat, but all the movement during combat is me, and she will be doing enemy callouts and things like that. So this is what co-pilots, even physically, will do. They will give me callouts for types of enemies and things if they know that information. And this is a clip from on stream, actually, from a recent stream of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice on Twitch that I did a couple of weeks ago. So let's roll this. And those voices are
What?
and those voices are
One
background
shadow
characters.
normal mid.
And that's Jenna.
Player control.
The mirror. The mirror. Focus. Stop it. She will die. Stop. Quickly get up.
Trying to. Ah, that was me realizing how to kill these
Sword
enemies.
glows blue-white when she goes into focus. Down. One normal. Down. One normal.
Finished.
Down. Done.
Whoa, that was surreal. So you can see not much was needed in the way of callouts there, but the callouts that were there were very useful. So let's go to and here's the links as well. If you want to contact me, you can find me at Sightless Kombat. So SIGHTLESSKOMBAT. Sorry, LESSKOMBAT, just to make sure everybody gets that clearly. On Twitter, YouTube, and Twitch, and on my website, www.sightlesskombat.com. So, yeah, and there's links there to my Twitch, my YouTube, my Twitter handle there, and also a couple of other articles there. So if you want to screenshot those, if anyone wants to, they can feel free to do so. So any questions before we wrap this up?
Yes, we've had a few come in. So one that came in, I think, when you were showing off the Jedi Fallen Order game, was whether or not the sound cues you were using were kind of part of the default audio, or whether or not it was a setting you turned on.
They are completely part of the default audio, which is why it's so good. That's partly why I played it through on stream as well, because when I first played that game at XO19, on the day of release, actually, I didn't even know it was coming out that day. I actually got to play it on the show floor, as it were, at an Xbox event up in London. And I was blown away by the fact that I could actually parry the blaster bolts without needing to be able to see or aim anything, because it deflects it on its own. You just need to know what cues you're listening for, which is absolutely brilliant. And hopefully more audio designers for games like the Soulsborne genre, as it were, so your Bloodborne, your Dark Souls, your Demon Souls, hopefully they take that into account and move away from what I would loosely describe as games that sound like they're from the PlayStation 2 or early PlayStation 3 era, and they have a lot less auditory detail in their combat mechanics.
A question coming in from Piers. And this is an interesting one for me, because I think a few times some of the features you were showing off were kind of like involved a kind of training mode or kind of a sandbox space.
Yes.
And he kind of talks about the idea of, well, I had trouble I had when learning to play via audio cues was this grueling process of learning what the audio cues meant. Is there any improvement for supporting new players in learning audio cues?
Okay. Oh, sorry. I was going to say if there was a more to the question, but that's a very good question. And you're completely right. The Last of Us 2, and actually Sequence Storm. I'm going to give a shout out and an honourable mention to Sequence Storm, a PC game. I know this presentation is focused on console titles, but PC games are slowly coming into their own in certain genres. Sequence Storm is a a rhythm racing game by an indie developer who is absolutely amazing and has got a fully accessible racing game for gamers without sight, and anybody else who wants to play it pretty much on both Steam and on itch.io as well. Both of those games have audio cue glossaries in various forms. The Last of Us 2 actually calls it audio cue glossary, and Sequence Storm, I can't remember. I think it just lets you view those sounds in a separate menu, and I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head. But that's a great thing to have an ability to view those sounds in an area where it's not going to be taxing. You're not going to be stressed out trying to fight enemies off at the same time. And also the tutorials for both of those games, when you have sound cues, they're normally in context. So with Last of Us 2, if you have all the hints on, you can go up to your first door and it will say, this sound cue means press triangle.